Welcome, everybody, to Nevertheless, She Persisted, Gender Bias in the Age of Gen AI. I'm Marc Hoag, chair of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's freshly minted AI in the Law section, along with my co-chair, Amanda Harris. And I'm the founder of HoagLaw.ai, where I serve as fractional general counsel to AI-first SaaS companies and tech startups generally, while spending my nights and weekends vibe coding all sorts of apps and websites, because of course I do. I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Chris Chambers Goodman. Professor Goodman is a professor at Pepperdine University School of Law, where she teaches constitutional law, evidence, and comparative anti-discrimination law. She writes and speaks frequently on equal protection topics, including implicit bias, algorithmic bias, affirmative action, and diversity. She's the author of California Evidence in Aspen's Examples and Explanations series and co-author of the Mendez, Goodman, and Minero Evidence textbook. So with that, let's get started. Professor Goodman, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. I am so excited to be here with you all today and looking forward to talking to you a little bit about some of the research that I've done on gender bias and adding in some of my some new research on gender bias under the age of artificial intelligence. And so what I want to do is I have an agenda on the next slide, and that's what I'm going to talk through. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the historical background and the statistical context that impacts women in the legal profession. After that, I'm going to give you a bit of a primer on sources of bias data in machine learning processes, so you can understand a little bit about how these processes may exacerbate and enhance existing biases that people have. We'll talk a little bit about some specific manifestations of gender bias in the law and in legal practice. And then in the final segment, we'll talk about some strategies for reducing bias in real life as well as online. And then finally, I'll try to leave about 5 or 10 minutes to get to the Q&A feature questions that you may have. And so in terms of just an introduction, we've been talking about women in the legal profession for decades, right? And we've seen steady advances, but yet we still see a lot of attrition. And there are many reasons for that attrition, but one reason that comes to mind and is part of the focus of today's conversation is the persistence of gender bias in the legal profession. And so I want to take a look back, and let's take a look at some of the historical background and some of the statistics that many groups, including the American Bar Association, have gathered about the progress of women in the legal profession. So if we go on to the next slide, you will see that we have numbers over time. We're going to go back to, on some of the slides, 1980, 1991, 2013, and take a look at the way that gender representation in the legal profession has progressed. So here you see JD degrees by gender, and you see a decline in the blue line, which is male degrees, and a substantial increase in the orange line on this slide of JD degrees being offered and being earned by female lawyers. And this is a 10-year period from 2013 to 2024. Now, this, of course, tracks what we see in college admissions as well, with an increasing number of women getting college degrees and a decreasing percentage of men getting their college degrees. So when you look at the JD degrees by gender, we see that we have more women graduating with JD degrees than we do men, which should bode well for perhaps achieving parity in the legal profession along gender lines. When you go to the next stage, female law firm associates. And I recognize not every female goes to a law firm. We have other statistics on government representation and those who go in-house and those sorts of things. But this is one of the easier ones to gather. In terms of female percentages of law firm associates, back in 1991, way back in the days when some of us might have graduated from law school, we were below 40%, 38%. Obviously, before then, the numbers were even lower. In the 1980s, it was below 30%. And so now, as of 2023, that number of female law firm associates has increased to over 50%. And that number continues to climb in the few years since these statistics have been gathered. Now, what we see, though, this more than 50% of law students and law graduates are women, and slightly more than 50% of law firm associates are women. But when we get to the next slide, we see that once we get to the partnership track, partners who identify as female are below 30%. And again, of course, the limits of statistics, we have to recognize, but based on the firms that were surveyed, and again, these are statistics gathered by the American Bar Association, so they're nationwide statistics. They may differ in some states, but we're still at under 30%, 27.8% law firm partners. We could further break this down into equity versus of counsel, equity and non-equity partners. And again, we see at the lower ranks, women are still well represented. And as we go through the higher ranks, women are less represented. We see a similar increase in government lawyers on the next slide. We have our orange line, which you see it's just surpassed right around the time of COVID, it looks like 2019, 2020. The number of female government lawyers surpassed the number of male government lawyers, and it's by about 1,500, 1,300 as of 2023 when our last statistics were available. So we are continuing to see these types of increases, which is good news, right? If we continue on to the next slide, we're also looking at general counsel. Those who are general counsel, this chart is limited to Fortune 100 companies. They were at 16% female in 2004, and less than 20 years later at 34%. So those, again, the numbers are trending in good directions. Similarly, with judges, we've seen a sharp increase in female federal judges, going from virtually none until 1980s, right, when larger numbers of women started to graduate from law school and have their time served to be appointed. And now we're up, quite high, 484 female federal judges as of 2024. And again, more have been appointed in the last year and a half as well. So that number continues to climb. In the state court system, we have some statistics on the state high court judges. We can also get them on the appellate courts, but didn't want to give you sort of too many slides in the very beginning of just statistics. But we see women are at 43% of high court judges. So the state Supreme Court, or whatever the state's highest court is called. Some states, of course, have a larger percentage, some a smaller percentage, but we're again getting closer to parity in that situation. So this is some of the good news, right? Steady increases, but we still have issues of, as we said, retention and advancement within the ranks. So now I want to put this in the context of Gen AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning processes, all of these things have become a greater part of our lives over the last 5 years-ish, or maybe for some of us just the last year. And we are beginning to hear information about biases that occur in machine learning processes. Now we have to step back, of course, because many people think about machines as objective, neutral. They don't have biases, right? Um, Algorithms can't be, can't favor one thing or the other. They do what they are programmed to do. And so, just to push back a little bit on this, we have to recognize that these algorithms are created by humans. These machines are trained by humans. These processes are corrected by humans. And many of the biases that humans already have will also become a part of these processes and have become a part of these processes. All right, so I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about some of the sources of bias in the machine learning processes, and I'm going to go over 6 different sources. There may be more, but we've narrowed it to 6 for purposes of this presentation. So the first sort of bias in machine learning processes is simply history. History is what history is. The number of people who have been president of the United States is a fixed number. And the number of people who have been president of the United States who have been female is absolutely zero, right? And so if the machine learning system is trained on historical data, who have been all the past presidents of the United States, and give me a prediction about whether or not this candidate or this candidate would be the stronger for a future presidential run, well, of course, being male will be a very large part of that equation because of history. And so, while large language models pride themselves on the volumes, the vast volumes of data that they're able to use and gather and work through and learn from, a lot of that data actually is going to perpetuate existing biases. Now, in part, women were not presidents for a lot of reasons, right? None have been elected, but for much of our nation's history, women weren't allowed to vote. And so if women weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to run for office either. But from a data perspective, just looking at the data and seeing no females does not give the machine the context, right? That women weren't allowed to vote, women weren't allowed to hold offices in many places. And so that would be an explanation for why the history may not be as useful of a tool in predicting future presidential candidates. So, in terms of history, there are lots of historical gaps of women's recognition in the law, women's recognition as legal actors, as those who are able to testify, to own property, to enter into contracts. All those types of things have a very different historical background for women than they do for men. And so, to the extent that these systems are being trained on historical data that kind of treats men and women equally at a time when they were not treated equally, that absence will be noticeable. Now, similarly, and related to historical bias is representation bias. And there, again, we're looking at who is represented in the data sets. And to the extent, again, that large language models are gathering lots of data, they may say, oh, we have data from millions of data points, right? But if the same groups are overrepresented in those data points and other groups are underrepresented in those data points, then is it really representative? And any prediction based on that volume of data may be less accurate. And, again, will have less predictive power. And so when we think about representation, for instance, one thing that you may be familiar with is facial recognition software, right? And facial recognition software, we've learned, can be highly accurate, but it's highly accurate for particular groups. For white men and for Chinese men, it is highly accurate because of the large volume of faces that have been used to train that data. For Black women, it's very inaccurate. For people with darker skin, for people with non-Caucasian or Asian features, it's really inaccurate. But if you lump in and say, we tested this on, people, populations throughout various cities in the United States, again, yes, it will be accurate for a segment of that population, but for another segment of that population, it will be entirely inaccurate. Now, in terms of measurement bias, again, what we measure what we think counts, and therefore, because we've measured it, it ends up counting. So there will be characteristics, for instance, that are not considered in by these large language models, by those who are designing the algorithms. And if they don't consider these characteristics, which may not be sort of on their face apparent in terms of, for instance, doing an employment application, right? Well, we all know that some aspect of having a good employee is not merely how they present orally, how they present in writing, but also if they have some sort of initiative, right? They will take the bull by the horn, so to speak. They will jump in and look for solutions instead of sitting back and waiting for solutions to drop into their laps. But if that's not measured in your online employment application, someone's sort of stick-to-itiveness, someone's initiative, well, then those who have initiative will not make it to the next round of the interview process because that wasn't asked in the questions, all right? That wasn't part of the application process and it wasn't tested. And so then what we get is, again, a gathering data, but we're gathering data about particular data points, but to the extent we're ignoring other data points, then the results that we see when we plug in candidates or applicants into our algorithms and see what pops out, the results that we see are not going to be entirely bias free. So those are three of the sources of bias data in machine learning processes. And now I'm going to talk to you about three additional sources of bias in machine learning processes. So aggregation is can be helpful, but it's also can be a big problem, again, when you're dealing with large data sets. So we all know from statistical analysis that if you have too small of a sample, then any results you have will not be statistically significant, right? Say that 3 times fast. Statistically significant. And so what we sometimes do is we will lump groups together so that we have enough data from which to make a prediction, for instance, or to make a recommendation. But the problem is when we aggregate disparate groups, then again, we may be overrepresenting certain groups in our data set and underrepresenting others. We may be misrepresenting certain groups. For instance, we can say the average woman is, I'm just going to say a number, is 5'4.5", because that's how tall I am. So if we say the average woman is 5'4.5", that may be true, but the average woman from particular ethnic groups or racial groups will have very different heights, right? And very different height averages depending on their race, depending on their location, country they're from, nourishment levels, socioeconomic status, all those types of factors can make a difference in what the height that someone grows to. And so when we aggregate the data and put all of the women together, while we have an accurate we have an accurate number on the average overall, it really doesn't mean much in terms of the individuals. And so this aggregation of data can become dangerous and even pernicious when the data is basically devouring minority and underrepresented groups. And so the greatest part of the data will be the majority groups. And so then again, we're not making accurate predictions for people within those underrepresented groups because of this aggregation. All right. The way that data is evaluated, and again, how we determine what is valuable and what is less valuable is another place where biases can creep in. So, taking again an example of algorithms used for hiring. They'll be used for both recruiting applicants, for encouraging applicants to apply, to screen resumes, and even to conduct digital interviews, screening interviews, before humans get involved at all. But one thing that we find with the evaluation that's being done by some of these algorithms in the employment context is that they've been programmed, each has been programmed in a way to look for certain things, but some of the things they look for can actually result in discrimination against people based on a lot of different factors that aren't being taken into account. For instance, many of these programs give high scores for eye contact, making eye contact with the camera, with the screen during the whole time of the interview. But in some cultures, it's disrespectful to make eye contact with someone who's senior to you, who's at a higher social status than you, a potential employer. That would be disrespectful. But in terms of evaluating that interview, what we see is, oh, they got a low score on eye contact, and therefore that's gonna play a role, but without being able to examine the cultural factors that may explain the lack of eye contact or the lower amount of eye contact, we're going to be missing out on probably very qualified candidates. In addition, for many people on the autism spectrum, eye contact is also very, very difficult. And so to judge them based on the lack of eye contact could violate anti-discrimination provisions under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, and UNRU Act, and other things like that. So that's another place where we want to think about how people are being evaluated, what are the metrics that are being used, and how were those metrics programmed into the algorithmic tools that we're using in order to make these decisions. And then a final source of bias data in machine learning processes is deployment bias. Excuse me. With deployment bias, there we have algorithms that are created, machine learning processes that were created and designed to do a particular job. And when we deploy them out into the real world, out into our legal work, our offices, whatever, if we use them for something else, something that they were not designed to do, well, then we may end up with worse results than if we hadn't used artificial intelligence at all. Okay, and one very prescient example of this is algorithms that were designed to provide sentencing recommendations and bail recommendations for judges. All right. So judges get a lot of, sentencing. They have a lot of bail issues that they need to consider. And some were concerned that judges may be biased in their sentencing decisions, biased based on race or ethnicity or, many other factors, poverty, and the same with bail decisions. And so it was thought we can design some programs that can take all the information about the convicted defendant to make a sentencing recommendation, or take all the information about the person who's accused to determine their future dangerousness or flight risk, and provide a score that can help the judge to determine whether or not someone should be released on bail on money bail in the states where there still is money bail, or to be held over as a danger, or whatever. And so what happened was the judges would input they'd have their clerks input the information, they'd get the recommendation, and then they'd think about the recommendation, and then they'd kind of tweak it. They'd do something with it, and then that would be what their sentencing recommendation was, or that would be what their bail recommendation was. And some studies were done after the fact to show that the algorithm acting alone was better than the algorithm plus the judge. The judge acting alone was better in terms of predicting future dangerousness, in terms of predicting who was a flight risk, who would come back for their trial or their hearing, than the two together. And that's because the algorithm wasn't designed to also factor in the human judge. Now, this was a few years ago, and obviously AI is increasing, expanding, and getting better and better at so many things. So we'll have to take a look at this again in the future, but recognizing that oftentimes systems are created for one purpose and used for a different purpose. I'll give you one other example of this deployment bias, and it was, I believe it was in Japan. There were algorithms that were used to help companies figure out which applicants had the greatest likelihood of accepting their offer of employment. And so these applications went out. I mean, these applicants only happened once a year. And so it was really, really important to the company to give offers to people that were more likely to accept, because if they made a bunch of offers to people who did not accept, there was no opportunity to make offers again for one year. And these for offers for recent graduates, recent university graduates. And so there was a program designed to determine which people are more likely to accept offers. And so employers were using that program to make their offers, to figure out which people were more likely to accept. But what happened is the company, unbeknownst to the candidates, applicants, or employers at the time, retained the data from previous years about individual applicants. And then so that when the next year or the next time an applicant applied, that data was also taken into account as to whether or not that individual had accepted offers or rejected offers in the past. And so that ended up being a deployment bias problem. It was not what the algorithm was designed to be used for, and it ended up being a source of shame, and the company had to issue many apologies. And so just keep in mind that when you are getting artificial intelligence technology systems from vendors, find out what is it exactly designed to do. Make sure that you are using it in the ways that it's designed to be used. Or if you need some other product or some other focus, then keep that in mind as well. And so those are some of the sources of bias data in machine learning processes that a lot of people seem to just not even think about. They think, oh, I plugged it in, it's searching the whole internet. I've got, the whole world at my fingertips. And what it comes up with is a neutral, unbiased response. And that's just not the case. And so now I want to just step back and talk just a little bit about implicit bias and explicit bias, and a little tiny bit about the science of those two. And so I know you've all had implicit bias CLEs, and we have this continuing legal education obligation. And so, just as a reminder, implicit bias is that intuitive, reactive, immediate, that quick, automatic response that you have. It's not the one that you sit and think about, not the one that you deliberate about, not the one that you hem and haw over. It's just, what is your instantaneous reaction? Many people will deny that they exhibit implicit biases, but that's part of the thing. Is it's not part of your consciousness, so you don't really know that you have an implicit bias. All right. So when we're talking about implicit bias in the gender context, we see that we have lots of um, stereotypes, generalizations, pictures that come into our mind when we're told, we may be told someone is a female litigator, or you have a female judge, or something like that. For many people, there will just be, thoughts that come into their minds whenever they hear a particular person's gender. There are certain associations that are made. All right, so when we're talking about implicit bias, oh, I better stay in the camera. When we're talking about implicit bias, I usually show a picture of a brain, right? The brain with all the nooks and crannies. And so I like to think about the those nooks and crannies as the well-worn paths that are easy for our brains to take. So when we see one stimulus, we see one person who looks a particular way, there's a path in here that takes me to a spot. So you may see a police officer, and you may have a path that goes to, oh, good, everything's safe, there's a police officer present. Or you may have a path that goes to, oh, there's a police officer present, I better mind my P's and Q's and make sure I don't do anything wrong, and maybe I want to get out of here, right? There's these paths that are in our brains. We don't have to think about them. It's just our instant reaction, our uneasy feeling. Some call it that gut feeling, something like that. And so these well-worn paths are our implicit biases. It's very easy for me to go from seeing the police officer to feeling a little bit of fear. All right, that's not a step that's difficult to make. Now, if I wanted to see a police officer and greet him warmly and be genuinely excited to see him, that's going to require some deliberation. That's going to require something in my thought process that is conscious, because my instant reaction is not that. Okay. And so when we are thinking about what are our instantaneous reactions, we know that those are based on generalizations, they're based on stereotypes, and they're based on our past experiences. Our past experiences are very present, even if we don't remember all of the experiences, and they're not at the top of mind. Past experiences are imprinted on our brains and have an influence on how we behave in particular situations. And so we have scientists have figured out a way to kind of test implicit bias, to measure the levels of implicit bias that people have without sort of, opening their brain up. And so the science of implicit bias, which was conducted by Project Implicit at Harvard many, many years ago, many of you may have taken these implicit attitude tests, they're called. But what they've done is defined and uh, uh, identified lots of different lots of different axes upon which people can be biased. So we have a couple here on this slide, associating women with home and career, or associating judges with males and females, right? And so what we find is when you're making a quick association, one that is one of those well-worn paths in your brain, you can do that very easily. When you have to make one of those associations that is not a well-worn path in your brain, it takes you longer. You have to stop and think about it. Okay. And so the difference between how quickly you can associate women with home versus how quickly or slower you associate women with career, that is the implicit bias score that Project Implicit has come up with. And so the way that these tests work, for those of you who have not taken any, and I put the link there in the slide, is they'll flash pictures, and you have a keyboard in front of you, and you click the left key for certain, to make a good association, let's say, and the right key to make a negative association. All right. And then it will ask you to make associations between women and career. And so it'll show you a picture of a woman. It'll show you a picture of a career that we might expect a woman to have. Or it'll show you a picture of a career that you do not expect women to have, and how quickly you can make those identifications and sort these photos that you see. That's how they get a baseline for sort of where you're starting. And then they flip it and ask you to do the reverse association and associate what you used to associate with good, you now need to associate with bad. And so how quickly can your brain make that adjustment? And that difference is, as we said, is the score. And so one thing that we find from these tests and the meta studies that were done analyzing these tests is that implicit bias manifests more under conditions of stress, under conditions of duress, under time constraints. The quicker you have to do things, the more likely you're going to revert to those well-worn paths in your brain. And so you're going to make the decision that you already have a pathway for. A lot Our implicit biases, when people take these tests, a lot of times they're very surprised by their results. They're surprised that a working woman, a professional woman who's worked all of her life, actually does have a slight preference for associating women with home and men with career than vice versa. All right. So that is something that, like I said, is surprising because these biases are implicit. In addition, what they found, and this is going to be useful for many lawyers and the judges in the room, right, is that people who profess to be objective, people who think that they are really fair, actually have higher incidence, higher levels of implicit bias when they take these tests. All right. So thinking that you're fair, trying to be fair, expecting that you're fair is not going to be enough to guarantee that fairness. And that's why we all want to stop and take a breath and think about where we may be behaving in a biased manner, even though we're not intending to, even though we don't think we are, even though we're not expecting that. So some of the critiques about implicit bias research are, first of all, a lot of us didn't grow up as digital natives. So anything that requires me to react quickly to a keyboard, I'm not going to be as fast at. And a response to that critique is that you're only tested against yourself. How quickly do you make the association that is stereotypical versus how quickly can you make the association that is counter stereotypical? All right. And so that is one critique is, it's a physical processing thing more so than a brain processing thing. Another critique about the implicit bias research, of course, is the sample. it's a voluntary thing to take these implicit attitude tests. They are sometimes required in college and university classes, but that's a whole different demographic, right? College and university students do not represent the United States or the world in large measure, and so there's a sampling issue with, it's people who actually are curious about whether or not they have implicit bias, and so maybe that is overrepresenting those who are predisposed towards implicit bias. So that is another critique. Another critique is that causation, as we know, is not the same as correlation. So the fact that I do score higher on an implicit bias test regarding people who are overweight, for instance, versus underweight, or something like that, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to treat people differently when I see them in real life if they are overweight. All right. And there's not a real good way for scientists to test that anyways. We ask people about their motivations, why they chose a particular candidate over another, those sorts of things. But if they don't tell us the reasons, we can't really get in their heads to know for sure what the basis is for people's conduct. Some additional studies were done and found about a 4% causation. So that's still a small part of a decision, 4%, but it is something that was measurable. So those are some of the critiques, the physical processing issue, the sampling size and representation within the samples, and the idea of correlation and causation not being the same. And then a final critique that I often hear, but we have lots of responses to that one, is, well, if everyone has implicit bias, then doesn't it even out? Because I have implicit bias against people like you have implicit bias against people like her, and she has implicit bias against people like me. So in the long run, everyone's biased, affected by implicit bias a little bit, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. But of course, the issue that we see from, years and years of people taking these tests is that people who are in minority groups still have implicit bias against minority groups. In part, it's not just based on our experiences ourselves as a person of color or a person of a majority group, but it's also based on our exposure to others, our exposure to media, our exposure now to social media. And so those exposures have an impact on people, so that when taking a race IAT, trying to associate darker skinned people or African American men's with good and positive words, and lighter skinned or white people with negative words, that's difficult for people of all races. Okay. And so, to the extent that implicit bias is present in people of all races, ethnicities, genders, and all those types of things, still the benefit is going to inure to those who are represented in the majority group. So that's a response to that final critique. And now I just want to give you a couple of highlights on algorithmic bias in hiring. So I've done some research on the use of algorithms and in the hiring context. And there's here 4 points I have on the slide here that you want to be thinking about, because I know some larger firms and organizations are using these AI tools for these employment AI tools, and some of your clients may be using them as well. And so the first step is this discrete elimination, right? There's no record. When I apply for a job online and an algorithm decides I don't even get to move to the next stage, that's it, right? Maybe I get a rejection letter, but that's it. So there's no audit trail. There's no information about sort of what did I do wrong, what information should I have included, that sort of thing. And it happens behind the scenes. So you all probably have heard the story of, one of the big tech giants who decided to use AI to try to hire and wanted to increase their representation of women in their organization. But what ended up happening is the resume tool that they developed was rejecting any resume that said something about women, about playing on a women's sports team, about women's issues. And so the algorithm was not designed to do that. They didn't say and reject women, but what they trained the algorithm on was the resumes of all of the highest ranking men in the company. They were trying to emulate the people who were in charge, and they happened to mostly be men. And so as a result, women's resumes were just booted out, booted out, booted out. That's still happening despite, years of people being aware of this sort of problem with resume screening. And a company was recently sued for screening out women over 60 and men over 65. And again, without asking questions about, age, without being programmed to violate the Age Discrimination in Employment Act or anything like that. It had kind of decided, based on the pool of candidate of people in the job, that people over this age weren't good. Okay, and so that elimination can happen, and with so many companies being male heavy, at least at the leadership ranks, or for so many jobs being dominated by men, this discrete elimination can occur without any programming, right? And so it really requires an effort to sort of, debug the program, to retrain the program, to make sure that these kinds of eliminations aren't made. And so even if the AI technologies are instructed, do not consider race or gender or whatever, there are proxies for these characteristics that can be observed from the data. And it may be things that humans wouldn't necessarily pay attention to, or that humans may not even recognize. But the AI technologies can. And so they end up basing decisions on protected categories inappropriately, but again, without anyone really knowing that that's the basis for the decision. Now, we've also got intellectual property and trade secret issues, so that could be a whole other talk. But one thing that I found in the research on employment algorithms is that some people end up getting permanently excluded from job searches because they've been rejected by the system, and then they apply again a year later to a different job. But if they've used the same system or have access to the same data, then that person now becomes the person who was rejected by this other company 2 years ago. And then they get rejected again, and now they're the person that has been rejected 4 times. That's sort of how they're seen in the data representation. And so it ends up that some people are never going to get jobs based if the decision making, or at least the initial decision making, is determined by AI technologies. All right, so that risk of permanent algorithmic exclusion is really a great one, especially now when so many people are using AI to not only create their resumes but also to send it out to all these places. And so that saturation of applications can actually come back to bite the person. And so in my article about our algorithmic bias and accountability for job applicants, one thing that I recommend is having clear systems for deleting data after a certain point. And data retention policies should be as narrow as possible in order to avoid this kind of permanent algorithmic exclusion. So that is just like a quick highlight on some of the issues that specifically arise in the hiring context. And now in our last few minutes, we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific manifestations of gender bias. And I want you to recognize that when we think about gender bias in the law, we're thinking about it from many, many, many different sources. Usually, back when I started, we kind of, looked at it from the senior partners or, managing partners, that sort of thing, judges, opposing counsel. But it also happens from peers, right? Supervisors. So when you're thinking about manifestations, think about all the different uh, uh, places that bias can sort of bombard people. And so one very common, and I'm sure there are lots of people in this room that have experienced this, is the misidentification bias, right? And so I used to get this all the time, and I still do, right? So I walk into the courthouse, and they would say, "I'm sorry, that's counsel table," and I say, "Yes, I'm counsel." But why did they say that's council table? Because they thought I wasn't, because I was young, because I was black, because I was female, who knows, right? But for some reason, even though I was wearing a suit like everyone else, had a briefcase, business cards, so that misidentification and the percentage of women lawyers who've been misidentified as secretaries, paralegals, other staff who have not been identified as lawyers or judges or partners is really astounding. It's something that continues to happen, and people say, "Well, oh, I didn't mean that. I just assumed." Right? I just assumed is part of the problem. Why do you assume that the woman is not an attorney and you assume that the man is? Even when he's not. All right. So think about these times when you misidentify people. It happens in the office, it happens in the hallway, it happens in the courtroom, it happens in the classroom, right? Another example is misimpressions. We form impressions of people very, very quickly in a lot of situations, and those impressions are hard to shake. They become a basis for things like confirmation bias and attribution bias. And so when we are putting people into categories and forming impressions about them based upon other people we know in that category, all right, then we're creating misimpressions or potentially creating misimpressions. And so much of this is basically when we are making assumptions about people before we actually give them a chance to prove themselves. And so that is something, again, to keep in the back of your mind when someone walks in late and oh, I guess you had trouble with your kids, or I guess, why would you say that about a female but not about a male attorney? And hopefully you wouldn't say it out loud in any event. Another thing that a lot of women lawyers and business people are concerned about is missing invitations. Colleagues will invite other colleagues out for drinks, other male colleagues out for lunch, out for golf, out for outings, events. And what I hear from some males who feel uncomfortable inviting females out because they're worried about sexual harassment, they're worried about discrimination issues. And so they figure it's easier if I just go out with the guys. But unfortunately, so much of work is relationships, so much of business development is having those relationships and the confidence of your partners and your peers and those around you. So those missing invitations end up being a manifestation of gender bias as well. And then this one I call Ms.ing, and that's this idea that so many people have that, if we're going to be having a meeting, let's get Chris to take notes in the meeting. She's a very thorough note taker. All right. Well, if Chris is female and Chris is always the one taking notes, well, then that's a Ms.ing of Chris. You're giving me the housekeeping tasks. And, Chris can order the food. Chris can get the coffee. Oh, Chris makes good biscotti. Let's have Chris do the snacks for the meeting, right? And so when women are often given housekeeping tasks like scheduling, being in charge of the minutes, of, taking notes, those sorts of things, again, we just want to be conscious of that. Yes, women can do those tasks, but they shouldn't be the only people doing those tasks. And yet these are things we see in the office, in chambers, in business areas as well. And so on the next slide, I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of gender bias. And so we've already talked about confirmation bias, expectation bias. Some people think of women as either Mary, Eve, or Superwoman, right? So they're either the Virgin Mary, can do no wrong, chaste, or they're Eve, the temptress, or they're Superwoman, and they can do everything. They can, juggle their work and their home and work on a brief overnight while they are flying to their child's graduation, all those sorts of things. And so again, some people tend to characterize women in one of these three categories, which again will lead to the misimpressions that I was talking about. When you use the word aggressive, versus assertive. And we often see this. Men are deemed to be assertive when they are firm, right, and raise their voice. And women are deemed to be aggressive if they raise their voice or try to be firm, right? It's a little bit difference in terms of the language, but it makes a big difference in terms of people's impressions and their abilities to rise up, to move forward. Similarly, when emotions are at play, if a man is emotional when delivering a closing argument or in a motion hearing or something like that, many people observe that as righteous indignation. If he's emotional, he must feel really wronged, or this must be a very horrible situation, right? It's not about him not being able to control his emotions. Whereas with a woman, she's considered overly emotional if she demonstrates the same level of what we otherwise would call righteous indignation. She may be deemed hysterical, but we don't use those terms with men. So be careful in these descriptions when emotions are involved. In terms of assertions versus tag questions, we see from lots of observations and studies that there are a number of women who raise their voice at the end of a sentence, and that suggests a lack of certainty, like they're asking a question, but they're not really asking a question. And so that also is a place where when people hear that, they kind of react as lack of confidence, not sure, not ready for leadership type things. But what you want to also consider is there are different speaking styles, there are different cultural speaking styles, and many younger people, men or women, also speak in that way. All right, now again, do looks matter? Yes, and we found that looks matter more in terms of a professional context and how women are treated than how men are treated. And so again, there's lots more to be said about that. And then in terms of voice modulation, voice tone versus voice pace, women with very high-pitched voices aren't taken seriously by a lot of people. Doesn't mean they don't know any more. They know less than people who speak in a lower tone, but sometimes that's just an instant place where people are dismissive. And so I'm going to give you just a couple of strategies for addressing bias in the legal profession. And it's pretty simple. It's ABC. As easy, no, it's not as easy as one, two, three. But the first one is awareness. You want to be aware of the possibility that you may be acting in a biased manner, that you may be responding, deciding, making developing an impression about someone that may be based on some biases that you have. Okay, so awareness is the first step. The second step is to think about some bias interrupters. So I'm going to give you those on the slide, and then I have just a few communication strategies or things to think about. So these will be sort of checklists for you to look at and try to incorporate as you can on through your daily lives. So on the next slide, we have A for awareness. Awareness makes a difference. So if you just be conscious of the fact that sometimes you act on assumptions, sometimes you jump to conclusions about people, and then you'll start to see which people do I jump to conclusions about. And you can see if there's some gender or age or race or ethnic or class or some other issue that really seems to be the trigger for this. When I say gender perks, one of the things that people sometimes comment about is some women using their looks or their charm to get benefits, right? And then that makes it harder for other women. And so that is something to be conscious of as well. But again, if you take the time to stop and think, to be aware of the possibility of bias, then that will help you avoid defaulting to bias. On the next slide, bias interrupters, you want to try to stop it when you see bias being exhibited. You want to try to stop it. And so if you're in a position to say, hey, wait a minute, I don't think we should have Chris be taking notes in the meeting. I mean, why can't we have John take notes in the meeting or something like that? Just small things like this can make a difference. So on the next slide on bias interrupters, another thing to do is to enhance your exposure to people that do not comport with the any stereotype that may exist. All right. So with this, we're thinking about, if one of the stereotypes is about women who leave early because of their kids, then what about women who have kids who work very hard, right? Activating these types of stereotypes or counter stereotypes in your mind will also make a difference. Notice your messaging. How do you talk to people, and what words do you use? We talked about aggressive versus assertive. And another bias interrupter is simply to stop and ask a question. Why do you say that? Or what do you mean by that? No challenge necessary, but you can sometimes make a difference there. And now on the next slide, we have communication strategies. So you want to think about when you're going to be communicating, whether this does involve a potential bias or other equity issue, and then think about when. Is this something that needs to be addressed in the moment? Or is it something where we need to take a break, we need to cool down, and I'm going to have a conversation, at a calmer level after the fact? So those are some of the decisions that you want to think about. You also want to think about where to have this conversation. Is this a private conversation? I tend to recommend private conversations to pull someone aside so they don't feel defensive. But sometimes if you're in a group, or particularly if you're in a leadership position and there's a public statement that can be very harmful, discriminatory to a member of your group, then you may need to make a public statement. And then when you are making statements, when you're having these conversations, just make sure you use I and we statements rather than the accusatory or finger pointing you. And so those are just a few quick strategies: awareness, making use of bias interrupters, and effective communication in order to address some of the gender bias issues that we see in the legal profession. And now we are right at time, so I will stay on to answer any questions that we have in the Q&A. And thank you so much for your attention today, and I wish you a good evening.
Alrighty, so it looks like we have one question from a Landwin. We are all human and make mistakes. What is a good way to recover from making an incorrect assumption or identification about someone?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we all do make mistakes. I mean, we may call someone the wrong name. We may attribute something to them that wasn't appropriate. And I think the best way to recover from those mistakes is to admit them both to yourself and forgive yourself, but also to the person to whom you made that mistake. So when I call a student by, by the wrong name, and I am putting that student in a category with other students who maybe look similar, but obviously is not the same person, I'm going to go later, I can apologize in a moment. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant Steve instead of Stefan or whatever. But then later I'm going to pull them aside and say, you know what, I really apologize for that misspeaking. I've been on the receiving end of that type of confusion, people thinking I'm someone else, and I know how hurtful it can be. So I just wanted to let you know that I apologize. Now, if you do that in front of the whole group, that could be even more embarrassing for them. So that's why I try to, do a quick, oh, sorry, and then later, say something if need be. And then the other thing is when you do apologize, when you do forgive yourself, you also want to think about how am I going to make sure that I don't do this again, right? Because that's really part of it. If you just keep calling the person the wrong name or whatever it is, you keep misattributing something to them, well, then your apology is really hollow and meaningless. So what steps can I take to make sure that I remember this is how this name is pronounced, or this is where you're from, not there? And so that's what I would suggest. So own up, apologize, pull them aside, and forgive yourself, and try to do better next time.
Alrighty, Professor Chambers Goodman. It looks like that's it for questions today. Thank you so much for leading this program, and thank you so much to our audience.
You're very welcome. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope everyone has a great day.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.